Summary executions in the Wild West were acts where a person was executed without undergoing a formal trial, often in public, as a way to punish serious crimes. This type of execution occurred in various places where law enforcement was more flexible and, in many cases, justice was carried out quickly and without legal process. When the population or authorities believed that a criminal should be punished quickly, lynchings were a common practice, especially in more isolated regions where local authorities were few and resources were limited. Duels were confrontations between two people who resolved personal or honor disputes with weapons. These events were common in the Wild West, especially in the 19th century, and were seen as a way to restore honor or resolve disagreements quickly and directly. A famous example of a duel was the OK Corral duel, which took place on October 26, 1881, in the town of Tombstone, Arizona. In this duel, the Earp brothers and their aide, Doc Holliday, faced the Clanton and McClory gangs, two groups of gunfighters. The event resulted in 3 deaths and marked one of the most well-known moments in the history of the Wild West. Honor codes were unwritten principles followed by many men in the Wild West. The code stipulated that when challenged to a duel, a man should accept the challenge, as refusing to fight could be seen as a loss of respect or courage. The death penalty in the Wild West was a punishment applied to criminals considered responsible for serious crimes, such as murder, bank robbery, and other violent acts. The most common form of execution was hanging, which was seen as a quick form of justice, with the idea of discouraging other crimes. One of the most frequent forms of punishment was flogging, where the offender was whipped on the back, often in a public square or in a visible area of the town. The number of lashes varied depending on the crime committed, and the victims could suffer serious injuries resulting in permanent scars. Criminals could also be sentenced to forced labor, such as working in mines or cleaning areas, often under extremely harsh conditions. Forced labor served both as a form of punishment and as reparation for the damage caused to society. Bounty rewards were monetary prizes offered by the authorities to anyone who could capture wanted criminals. These rewards emerged as a way to encourage the population to help capture outlaws, who were often difficult to locate due to the lack of police infrastructure. The governor of Missouri offered a reward of $10,000 for the capture of Jesse James, and in 1882 he was killed by one of his own members, Robert Ford, who received the reward. The bounty hunter culture was common in the Wild West, consisting of people hired to capture wanted criminals in exchange for a monetary reward. In many cases, they were seen as mercenaries, willing to use any means necessary to capture their targets. The mask law was a public punishment practice that occurred in some towns in the Wild West. When a man was accused of a crime such as theft or deception, and the community decided that he deserved severe punishment, he was placed under the shame mask. The goal was to publicly shame the accused and mark him as someone who violated the community's norms. One of the most important unwritten laws in the Wild West concerned horses. If a horse was stolen, the crime was considered one of the most serious, as horses were essential for transportation and work in the West. Stealing a horse could result in severe punishment, including hanging. One of the most famous prisons of the Wild West was the Yuma Prison in Arizona. It became famous for its location in an arid and isolated desert, and for being a maximum security prison where many criminals and outlaws were held. This prison had a large number of famous fugitives, such as Billy the Kid, who passed through its cells. Its famous brick and iron wall was a symbol of the harshness of the Western penal system. Tom Horn, a bounty hunter and gunslinger, was accused of killing a young boy in 1901. Although Tom Horn was convicted and hanged, many believe his conviction was unjust and that he was lynched as part of personal revenge rather than for a real crime. Sam Bass was a famous outlaw of the Wild West, known for robbing trains and banks. After being captured, Sam Bass was taken to the town of Round Rock, Texas, where he was surrounded by a large crowd. Although he was severely injured, a group of enraged civilians decided to take justice into their own hands. During the Wild West, many people were born in remote areas, and there was no formal birth registration system. This led to legal disputes over property, inheritance, and other matters, as the lack of birth records made it difficult to prove identity. Although the presence of women in law enforcement was rare in the Wild West, some women managed to hold positions as police officers. They generally worked in towns that lacked sufficient police force and were known for their courage and ability to deal with criminals. Mattie Silks, for example, was one of the few women who became a figure of authority in a western town, managing a saloon and acting informally in law enforcement. William Tilghman was a bounty hunter and sheriff in the Oklahoma Territory and the state of Kansas. He became famous for his skill in capturing wanted criminals and for being a respected figure in law enforcement. He was also known for his weapon skills and for his strategy in dealing with criminal gangs. In 1890, Tilghman captured members of the Dalton Gang, a famous group of criminals, after several chases. His work as a bounty hunter helped reduce the amount of crime in the area, and he quickly became an important figure in the history of the Wild West. The Montana Vigilantes, formed in 1863, was a group created to combat criminal gangs terrorizing local communities. The Vigilantes were ordinary citizens who banded together to protect their lands and families from bandits. They, on many occasions, made quick judgments and applied severe punishments, such as hangings, without a formal legal process. Estate justice was the practice of resolving disputes over the inheritance of a deceased person without the intervention of a formal judicial system. When a man died, his property was often left without a clear will. In many isolated areas of the Wild West, estate justice was settled through direct disputes, such as confrontations or even duels. In many communities, the idea of justice was not based on formal courts, but rather on good faith justice, where a man's word was his greatest proof. If someone committed a crime, the word of a witness or respectable citizen could be enough for them to be considered guilty. The sheriffs of the Wild West dressed in a practical and imposing manner to ensure their authority was recognized. They wore hats, usually made of felt or cowboy hats, which were typical of the time. The hat helped protect them from the sun and identified the person as a figure of authority. The star badge, usually made of metal, was placed at the front of the shirt or vest, signaling the sheriff's position. The boots, made of leather, were essential for daily work and for riding horses, as horseback riding was common. The jails of the time were makeshift and improvised prisons, built in small towns or rural areas where there were no resources to build large prison establishments. These jails were located in wooden buildings, stables, or even barns, often with iron bars or wooden gates. Prisoner escapes were common in the Wild West, especially due to the precarious conditions of the jails. In some cases, prisoners received help from outside accomplices or other prisoners. Escapes were often followed by chases, as sheriffs or bounty hunters tried to recapture the fugitives. Pancho Villa, one of the most famous Mexican revolutionary leaders, was captured in 1916 after a series of military activities against the Mexican government and the forces of the United States. Villa, who was responsible for violent attacks along the border between Mexico and the United States, was briefly imprisoned. A major event in the history of outlaws was the Northfield bank robbery, which occurred in 1876, carried out by brothers Jesse and Frank, who were part of the famous outlaw group, the James Younger Gang. During the robbery, local police and citizens joined together to face the criminals, resulting in the death of several gang members and the capture of Jesse James. In some towns, citizens gathered in makeshift courts, where they decided the punishment to be applied to captured criminals. Although these popular trials were quick, they were often seen as fair by the community, as local authorities had little ability to handle crimes. One of the most well-known legal conflicts between Native Americans and settlers was the Sioux War of 1876, which took place on the Great Plains, in what is now the state of Montana. During this war, the Sioux and Cheyenne resisted the invasion of their lands by settlers and military forces. One of the key moments of the Sioux War was the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, where the forces of Commander George Custer were defeated by the native forces. This event is famous because it was one of the greatest victories of Native Americans during the colonization period. The Indian Removal Act, signed in 1830, forced several tribes to leave their lands. In addition, the government attempted forced assimilation, requiring Native Americans to adopt the customs and culture of settlers, including education in schools, where they were prohibited from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. The Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where hundreds of Lakota Sioux were killed by U.S. troops while unarmed. This massacre is one of the tragic milestones of the conflicts, reflecting the end of the military power of Native tribes in the West. During the expansion to the West, many Native Americans and African Americans were targets of unjust lynchings, often without any real accusation or with unfounded accusations. Lynching was often used to intimidate minorities and reinforce social control through fear. Mary Ann was a woman who lived in Montana in the year 1862. She was accused of killing her daughter, but there was no clear evidence of her guilt. Still, a group of citizens decided to take justice into their own hands. They captured her and lynched her. In 1889 in Wyoming, William Johnson, an African-American man, was accused of killing a white police officer. He was arrested without a formal trial. Without waiting for a legal process, a group of people lynched William Johnson, hanging him in a public square. Wyatt Earp was one of the most famous bounty hunters of the Wild West. He was born in 1848 in the state of Illinois and worked as a lawman, miner, and bounty hunter. Earp became famous for his role in the OK Corral gunfight. In 1881, in New Mexico, Pat Garrett, a bounty hunter and sheriff, became famous for hunting down and killing Billy the Kid, one of the most wanted criminals in the Wild West. Pat Garrett, although praised for capturing and killing Billy, also faced controversies. Some believed Billy was wronged and that his death was unnecessary. Charlie Siringo was a famous bounty hunter of the Wild West, known for his skill in capturing criminals and outlaws. Working as a detective for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency made him one of the most respected hunters of the time. In 1907, he published a book called A Texas Cowboy, in which he detailed his experiences as a bounty hunter and detective. The book became an important historical source, offering a unique insight into the operations of bounty hunters in the Wild West and about the life of one of the most notable detectives of the era. John Slaughter was a bounty hunter active in the regions of Arizona and Texas during the late 19th century. He became known for his skill in capturing outlaws and wanted criminals, as well as for his role as sheriff in several towns in the West. The jails in Wild West towns were very primitive, and some places used iron chairs to hold the most dangerous criminals, with prisoners being tied to iron chairs or chains during their incarceration. One such person who had this experience was J.P. Robinson, who was arrested in Nebraska in 1901 for running a scam in which he bought beer with Mexican dollar. The Cowboy Code was a set of rules and principles followed by the field workers responsible for cattle management in the Wild West. This code was not a formal law, but a series of conduct norms that helped maintain order among cowboys, especially in an environment where formal law was hard to apply. The code involved values like respect for others, loyalty, and honesty. In addition, the Honor Code also included rules regarding the treatment of animals. Cowboys were known to be very careful with the animals under their responsibility, and an important part of the code was ensuring the cattle were well treated and not overburdened. There was an unwritten law that prohibited men from riding without a gun belt. The justification was that if the man was without the belt, he would be defenseless in a dangerous environment and could not protect himself or others. However, unarmed people ended up being even more defenseless and exposed to danger due to this custom, as they were seen as easy prey. In the Wild West, especially in desert regions, Water was a precious and often scarce resource. Many legal disputes arose over the ownership of water sources. Informal laws were established to resolve water disputes, but these laws varied from town to town, with conflicts arising between farmers, miners, and native communities. Many men in the Wild West followed an unwritten code of gentlemen, which dictated that a man should never attack another in his home or while in a vulnerable position. This meant that duels, if necessary, were often held outdoors, in the middle of a street, or in open areas, to ensure a fair fight between the participants. The gunmen of the Wild West often followed their own honor code. A gunslinger who attacked someone from behind or in a treacherous manner could be considered a man without honor and would lose respect in the community. Although it seems unlikely today, some places in the Wild West allowed citizens to compete in knife throwing as a form of recreation or skill demonstration. There were designated areas for this, and in some cases it was seen as a way to prove courage or strength of character. With the growth of railroads in the Wild West, new types of criminals emerged, such as train robbers. These criminals robbed trains, looting cargo, and even kidnapping passengers. The authorities soon realized they needed a specialized police force to combat the train robbers. This led to the formation of Pinkerton Agents, one of the first private detective agencies, which helped capture many of these criminals. Although today Las Vegas is famous for its casinos and nightlife, during the Wild West era, it was a frontier town where laws were frequently disregarded. The town was known for being a place where criminals could hide and do business out of reach of authority. The Comanches followed a very strict code regarding honor and respect, with severe punishments for breaking important rules, such as betrayal or theft of sacred goods. These codes of conduct were often more respected within the tribes than any external law imposed by settlers or military forces. Some outlaws of the Wild West were known as hired guns. They were hired to steal, intimidate, or even kill at the behest of others. For example, some bandits were paid to steal cattle, while others were paid to kill business competitors or political enemies. Cattle theft was a common crime in the Wild West, and there was an unwritten law among cowboys that governed cattle ownership. If a cowboy was caught stealing cattle from another, the punishment was usually harsh, with lynchings and public executions being common practices. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed any citizen willing to work the land for 5 years to claim it as their own. However, this also led to many legal and territorial conflicts, as settlers often clashed with Native Americans or other settlers over who had the right to which piece of land. In many parts of the Wild West, sheriffs used silver star badges. However, the stars were not standardized, and each town or county could choose the shape and material of the badge. Some sheriffs also used gold or bronze badges, depending on the region. In some regions, there were groups called Avengers, formed by family or friends of murdered people. These groups operated outside the law, seeking revenge against those responsible for the crimes. Many of these Avengers acted as a sort of informal court, applying their own version of justice. Churches had a great influence in the Wild West and were often centers of moral authority, especially in smaller towns. Pastors and religious leaders were respected, and their opinions on morality and local laws were often followed. Pastors often took part in mediating legal disputes. When a crime occurred in some Wild West towns, especially in remote places, the destruction of evidence was a common practice. In an era without systems for storing evidence or forensic investigation, many criminals were freed or escaped justice due to the lack of concrete evidence. Some Wild West towns imposed gun control laws, prohibiting people from carrying weapons within the town limits. These laws were created to reduce violence in urban areas and ensure the safety of citizens. However, in many towns, these laws were not widely enforced, as outlaws and gunmen could easily bypass them. Dodge City was one of the most famous towns of the Wild West, known for its violence and for using harsh laws, such as the prohibition of carrying guns inside the town. It was home to many famous gunmen, such as Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, who worked as sheriffs and helped maintain order. San Quentin Prison is one of the oldest prisons in the United States, founded in 1852. During the Wild West period, San Quentin was a place where many criminals, especially outlaws, were held after being captured. The prison was famous for its location by the San Francisco Bay, making it practically impregnable by water and difficult to escape. Abilene was one of the first cities to become a stopping point for cattle herds during the cattle drives era. Sheriff Wild Bill Hickok was appointed to enforce the law in the town in 1871, and he became famous for his skill with firearms and the way he handled criminals. Deadwood was a famous town during the gold rush in the 1870s and became known for its lack of authority. For a long time, the town was a center of criminal activities, with many violent disputes between miners, bandits, and criminals. The town only gained true law enforcement when Sheriff Seth Bullock was appointed. In many areas of the Wild West, property destruction was seen as a form of revenge or justice. If someone was accused of theft or treason, the community could attack the accused's property as a form of popular justice. Gambling was a popular activity in Wild West towns, with saloons and gambling tents crowded with players. However, in some areas, gambling was outlawed, which resulted in confrontations between local authorities and saloon owners. Even with the prohibition, the laws against gambling were often ignored, and games took place in secret, with figures like Wild Bill Hickok becoming a sort of gambling vigilante, ensuring that bets were made fairly. Some towns in the Wild West had a shotgun law, which prohibited the carrying of weapons within certain limits. In many cases, citizens were required to leave their guns at the entrances of towns, especially in busy areas like saloons, where violence was common. In many saloons of the Wild West, there were informal laws that limited the amount of alcoholic drinks that could be served to an individual. These rules were set up to prevent violent fights, which were common when people drank too much. The Antlers Hotel fire, which occurred in 1898, was one of the most tragic disasters in the history of Colorado Springs, in the state of Colorado. The Antlers Hotel was a famous and luxurious hotel in the city, and its fire drew attention to the lack of safety measures in public and private buildings at the time. The Johnson County War was a bloody confrontation between cowboys and large landowners, in which the ranchers tried to enforce their own laws, using an army of mercenaries to combat cattle rustling. They hired bounty hunters and ex-soldiers to form a private army. The Sand Creek Massacre occurred in 1864 when the Colorado militia attacked a camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho natives, resulting in the death of about 200 natives, including women and children. The massacre was one of many instances of violence against Native Americans during the westward expansion process. The 9-month law was an informal rule mainly applied among miners of the West. It dictated that if a woman was pregnant and lived in a Wild West town, the man responsible for the pregnancy had to marry her within 9 months to ensure the child would be legally recognized. Frank James, brother of Jesse James, was one of the most well-known criminals of the Wild West. After years of criminal activity, including bank and train robberies, Frank surrendered to the police in 1882. He was tried and convicted, but in 1883 he was released, and after Jesse's death, he retired from the life of crime. In 1915, Frank James died of natural causes. Pretty Boy Floyd was a famous outlaw who committed a series of bank robberies during the Great Depression. He became a popular figure and was considered a modern Robin Hood, as he reportedly helped the poor during his robberies. In 1934, Floyd was ambushed and killed by Oklahoma police in a coordinated operation. His death was a widely publicized event at the time, reflecting how the law tried to deal with criminals during the Great Depression. The Bear River Massacre occurred in 1863 when U.S. Army forces attacked a Shoshone village in northern Utah. The attack resulted in the death of about 250 to 400 Shoshone natives, including women and children. Black Bart, the infamous bank robber who mainly operated in California, was famous for his ability to escape capture. He was known for his bank robberies, where he used a long-bladed knife to threaten the tellers and make demands. Tombstone is famous for being the site of the OK Corral gunfight, which took place in 1881 between the Earp brothers and the Clanton gang. The Tombstone Jail was a place where many outlaws were imprisoned, including members of gangs and wanted criminals. The Fort Smith Prison was an important location during the Wild West, especially because Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, presided over many outlaw trials in the region. The prison was a central point for those convicted of serious crimes, such as murders and robberies. Leavenworth Prison, built in 1863, is one of the most famous prisons in the West. Although it became more widely known in the 20th century, during the Wild West, it was already operational and received criminals from various parts of the country. Fort Laramie was an important military base during the Wild West, serving as a support point for settlers traveling westward. In addition to being a strategic point for the United States Army, the fort was essential in negotiating treaties with native tribes. Cheyenne was one of the most important towns in the development of railroads in the Wild West. The town was a center for sheriffs and authorities who worked to reduce the violence associated with the rapid growth of the town and the arrival of new settlers. Pecos was an important town in negotiating cattle-related laws and protecting the interests of ranchers. The town, located on cattle drive routes, was a place where criminals were often captured by local sheriffs, who were responsible for controlling the violence between cowboys and other groups passing through the region. Although not directly related to the Wild West, the Morrill Act had a major impact on expansion westward. It granted lands for the creation of agricultural colleges in several states, encouraging the development of technical and scientific education. The law helped support the colonization of the West and the growth of cities.